The shocking tale of a child born from a cow's womb in World Stories. The golden rays of the morning sun pierced through the gaps in the old wooden barn, illuminating a scene so surreal that it left the onlookers speechless. There, on the soft bed of hay, lay a newborn child nestled against the warm flank of a cow. The cow, a gentle white beast named Luma, nuzzled the baby protectively, her large, soulful eyes watching the small crowd of villagers gathered at the barn's entrance. Whispers and gasps filled the air, a mixture of awe and fear as they struggled to comprehend the sight before them. The story begins in a remote village nestled in the foothills of the Alvalon Mountains. A place where superstition and tradition intertwined with everyday life, and the line between miracles and curses was often blurred. The villagers were simple folk, farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen, whose lives revolved around the rhythms of nature. Among them was Clara, a midwife and herbalist, who was known for her kindness and skill in delivering babies. Clara had seen countless births in her time, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to encounter. 2 weeks earlier, Luma had shown strange signs. She had been restless, her usual calm demeanor replaced by agitation. The farmer who owned her, old Burton, a man of grizzled hair and a gruff exterior, had noticed the change but brushed it off as a passing ailment. "Cows get sick, it's nothing new," he muttered to his neighbors when they asked. But Clara had her suspicions. She had visited Burton's farm to examine the cow, sensing something unusual in Luma's behavior. "There's a life force within her that's not right," Clara had said cryptically, her hand resting on Luma's swollen belly. Burton scoffed, unwilling to entertain the midwife's vague warnings. The night before the event, a storm had swept through the village, its ferocity shaking windows and uprooting trees. As lightning cracked the sky, Burton had been woken by a strange noise coming from the barn, a low, mournful groaning, unlike anything he had heard before. Grabbing his lantern, he had trudged through the rain to investigate. What he found left him frozen in shock. Luma was in the throes of labor, but instead of delivering a calf as he expected, she birthed a human child. The storm seemed to pause for a moment, as if nature itself held its breath. Word of the miraculous birth spread like wildfire through the village. By dawn, the barn was filled with curious and frightened faces. The town's priest, Father Elias, arrived shortly after, clutching his rosary. "This could be the work of the divine or the devil," he declared, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Beside him stood Greta, the village gossip, who whispered to anyone who would listen, "I've heard of such things in stories, but never thought I'd live to see one." Among the crowd was a young woman named Eliza, who had been struggling with infertility for years. Her eyes welled with tears as she looked at the child. "Could it be a gift from the heavens?" she murmured, her voice tinged with hope. But not everyone saw the event in a positive light. Hugo, the blacksmith, a staunch skeptic, crossed his arms and growled, "This is unnatural. Such things should not exist. We ought to destroy it before it brings misfortune upon us." Clara pushed her way through the crowd, her heart pounding. Kneeling beside the baby, she examined him carefully. He was healthy, his tiny body wrapped in a radiant warmth that seemed to emanate from within. "This child is no curse," she said firmly, silencing the murmurs. "Whatever brought him here, he deserves a chance at life." But the complications were only beginning. The villagers were divided. Some believed the child was a miracle, a sign of divine intervention, while others feared he was a harbinger of doom. The local council convened an emergency meeting in the village hall to decide the fate of the child. Arguments erupted, tempers flared, and alliances were tested as the community grappled with the unprecedented situation. Meanwhile, Clara took the baby into her care, naming him Orion after the constellation she had seen in the stormy sky that night. Luma, the cow, seemed oddly attached to the child, mooing plaintively whenever he was taken out of her sight. Clara's home became a sanctuary for both the child and the cow, but it also became the epicenter of the village's turmoil. Protesters gathered outside her door, demanding that she hand over the child for purification. Others brought offerings of food and flowers, treating the baby as a sacred figure. As the days passed, strange occurrences began to unfold. Crops that had been withering from a long drought suddenly began to flourish. Sick villagers found themselves inexplicably healed after visiting Clara's house. Even Hugo, the skeptical blacksmith, found that his failing forge suddenly roared to life, producing the finest metal he had ever worked with. These events only deepened the mystery surrounding Orion's origins. Was he truly a blessing, or was he something else entirely? Complications arose when a group of strangers arrived in the village. Dressed in dark cloaks and speaking in hushed tones, they claimed to be scholars from the distant city of Arcanis. They had heard rumors of the miraculous birth and insisted on studying the child. Clara was immediately suspicious of their intentions. "He's not some experiment for you to poke and prod," she said, standing protectively in front of Orion. But the strangers were persistent, offering gold and promises of protection in exchange for the child. Tensions reached a boiling point when Father Elias declared that the child must be taken to the cathedral in the city for a formal blessing and examination. "If he is a gift from God, we must honor him by presenting the child to the church," he proclaimed. But others, like Greta and Hugo, argued that taking Orion away would only invite disaster. "He belongs here, with the people who found him," Greta insisted, for once aligning herself with Clara. The final straw came when Luma fell gravely ill. The once vibrant cow that had nurtured Orion now lay weak and motionless, her breaths shallow. Clara realized that the bond between Luma and Orion was deeper than anyone had imagined. As the village prepared for what they feared might be Luma's final moments, Orion let out his first cry, a sound that resonated through the barn like a bell, causing the air itself to shimmer. Luma's eyes opened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though life flowed back into her. The villagers watched in stunned silence as a golden light enveloped the barn, radiating from Orion and Luma. Something extraordinary was happening, something that defied all logic and reason. But whether it was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. The golden light faded as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the barn in an eerie silence. No one dared to speak, their gazes fixed on Luma and Orion. The cow, once on the brink of death, now stood tall, her vitality fully restored. Her fur glistened as though kissed by sunlight, and her deep, gentle eyes exuded an almost human intelligence. Orion, too, had changed. His once normal cry now carried an otherworldly tone, resonating in a way that made the hair on the back of everyone's neck stand on end. The villagers, still frozen in the doorway, began to murmur among themselves. "This isn't natural," Hugo hissed, his face pale. "This child isn't just strange, he's dangerous." "No," Eliza countered, stepping forward with trembling hands. "Did you not see? He saved her. Whatever this is, it's good." Father Elias, clutching his rosary tightly, finally found his voice. "We mustn't let fear blind us. We need guidance from the church. This is beyond our understanding." Clara stepped forward, cradling Orion in her arms. "No one is taking him anywhere," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "He's just a baby, not a symbol for your superstitions. Whatever he is, he deserves love, not fear." Her words stirred something in the villagers, but their fear wasn't so easily quelled. The strangers from Arcanis, who had been watching the scene intently, finally stepped into the barn, their presence causing the villagers to part like a tide. The tallest of them, a gaunt man with piercing eyes and a sharp voice, spoke. "You've all witnessed what this child can do. He is no ordinary infant. He may hold the key to something far greater than this village can comprehend." He turned to Clara. "You may think you're protecting him, but you're standing in the way of understanding. A discovery that could change the world." Clara narrowed her eyes. "And at what cost? You'd rip him from the only home he's ever known, treat him like a specimen to be dissected, and for what? So you can parade him as a trophy of your understanding?" The man smiled thinly. "We only wish to ensure his safety. And the safety of everyone else." The veiled threat hung heavy in the air, but before Clara could respond, a loud crack of thunder erupted outside, though the skies were clear. The villagers gasped, some falling to their knees. Orion's eyes, wide and innocent, seemed to glow faintly for just a moment before returning to normal. It was as though the world itself was reacting to his very existence. That night, Clara stayed awake, rocking Orion gently in her arms as Luma lay nearby, her head resting on the hay. Outside, she could hear the murmurs of the villagers as they debated what to do. Some wanted the baby taken to the city, others demanded he be left in the village, while a few, like Hugo, whispered darker suggestions of removing the threat altogether. Clara's mind raced. She had always been a practical woman, relying on herbs and her hands to bring life into the world. But this was beyond anything she had ever encountered. Orion wasn't just a child. He was something extraordinary, and that made him a target. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She froze, her grip on Orion tightening. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice low but steady. "It's me." Eliza's voice came from the other side. "Please, Claire. I need to speak with you." Clara hesitated, then opened the door a crack. Eliza slipped inside, her face pale but determined. "I want to help," she said quietly. "I've seen the way they're talking, Clara. Some of them are scared enough to do something stupid." Clara nodded, her expression grim. "I know. And I won't let anything happen to him." Eliza glanced at Orion, her eyes softening. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "I've wanted a child for so long, but not like this. Not under these circumstances." Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then help me protect him. We'll need to stay one step ahead of their fear." Eliza nodded, but before they could speak further, a loud commotion erupted outside. Yells and shouts echoed through the night, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Clara's heart sank. "The barn!" she exclaimed, rushing to the window. Outside, a group of villagers led by Hugo had broken into the barn, their torches casting flickering shadows against the walls. Luma was surrounded, her eyes wide with panic as the mob advanced on her. They were shouting about curses and purging evil, their fear driving them to madness. "No!" Clara screamed, handing Orion to Eliza. "Stay here. Lock the door." Before Eliza could protest, Clara ran outside, throwing herself between Luma and the villagers. "Stop this madness," she shouted. "What are you doing?" Hugo stepped forward, his torch held high. "That cow gave birth to a human child. It's not natural. It's an abomination, and you're protecting it." Clara's eyes blazed with fury. "And what do you think killing her will accomplish? She's done nothing but nurture and protect. Are you so blinded by fear that you've forgotten your humanity?" For a moment, Hugo faltered, but the mob's anger was like a wildfire, too far gone to be easily extinguished. Before anyone could act, Orion's cry pierced the air. It was unlike any sound they had heard, a haunting, melodic wail that seemed to freeze time itself. The torches flickered and died, plunging the barn into darkness. When the light returned, the villagers were on their knees, their faces pale with terror. Hugo dropped his torch, his hands trembling. What is he?" he whispered. Clara stood tall, her voice steady. "He's a child. And he's under my protection. If you can't see that, then you're no better than the darkness you claim to fight." The villagers, shaken and uncertain, began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. Hugo cast one last glance at Clara, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking away. Clara returned to the house, her heart pounding. Eliza stood by the door, Orion in her arms. "That sound," she began, but Clara shook her head. "I don't know what he is, Eliza," she admitted. "But I do know this. He's here for a reason. And it's up to us to make sure he survives long enough to find out what that reason is." The night passed in an uneasy calm, but the events at the barn had left a deep scar in the village's fragile unity. Clara barely slept, her mind replaying the haunting cry that had silenced the mob. Orion rested peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythmic motion, unaware of the chaos he had caused. Eliza stayed by her side, her resolve strengthening with every passing moment. If the village wouldn't protect the child, then she would. By morning, the atmosphere in the village had shifted. Rumors spread like wildfire, each tale more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed Orion's cry had summoned spirits to punish the mob, while others insisted he was a demon sent to test their faith. Father Elias called for calm during his morning sermon, urging the villagers to seek divine guidance. Yet even his words couldn't erase the lingering fear and suspicion that hung in the air. The strangers from Arcanes remained in the village, their intentions increasingly opaque. They visited Clara's house under the guise of offering help, but their probing questions about Orion's behavior and abilities betrayed their true motives. Clara refused to let them near the child, her mistrust of them growing with each encounter. 2 days later, things took an unexpected turn when the village's crops began to grow at an unprecedented rate. Stalks of wheat that had been stunted for months suddenly stood tall and golden. The apple trees in the orchard bore fruit so abundant that their branches bent under the weight. Even the flowers in the meadows bloomed with vibrant colors that hadn't been seen in years. The villagers were astonished, their fear momentarily replaced by wonder. "It's him," Greta whispered to her neighbor as they gathered the bounty. "The child did this. He's a blessing, not a curse." Others weren't so sure. Hugo, still nursing his wounded pride from the previous night, remained skeptical. "Or it's a trick," he grumbled, watching the villagers flock to Clara's house with offerings of food and gifts. "Mark my words, nothing good comes without a price." Despite Hugo's warnings, the mood in the village began to shift. People who had once avoided Clara's house now visited daily, leaving offerings and asking for Orion's blessing. Clara was overwhelmed but wary. She had seen how quickly fear could turn to devotion, and she knew it wouldn't take much for the tide to turn again. One afternoon, while Clara was tending to Luma, she heard a knock at the door. Opening it, she found Father Elias standing there, his expression somber. "May I come in?" he asked. Clara nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Elias glanced at Orion, who was lying in a makeshift crib near the fireplace. His expression softened. "He looks ordinary," he said, almost to himself. "He is ordinary," Clara replied, her voice tinged with defiance. "He's just a baby." Elias sighed, sitting down at the table. "You know that's not true, Clara. Whatever he is, he's not ordinary. The villagers are calling him a miracle, but miracles are often misunderstood. I fear what will happen if their expectations aren't met." Clara folded her arms. "And what would you have me do? Hand him over to the church? To those strangers from Arcanes? He's safer here." "For now," Elias admitted. "But how long can you protect him? The villagers' faith is fickle. If something goes wrong, if the crops fail or someone falls ill, they'll blame him. And they'll blame you." Clara's jaw tightened. "Then I'll fight for him. I won't let fear dictate his fate." Elias regarded her for a long moment before standing. "You have a kind heart, Clara, but kindness alone won't be enough. Be careful." As the days turned into weeks, Orion's influence on the village grew. The crops continued to thrive, and the villagers began to see him as a source of hope. They came to Clara not only for blessings but also for advice, treating her as a guardian of the child's supposed power. Clara did her best to temper their expectations, but it was clear that Orion had become a symbol of something much larger than himself. But the harmony was short-lived. One evening, a tragedy struck. A young boy named Tomas fell ill with a sudden and mysterious fever. His parents, desperate for a cure, brought him to Clara's house, begging for Orion's blessing. Clara tried to explain that she wasn't a healer and that Orion was just a baby, but the parents were insistent. "Please," the boy's mother sobbed, clutching Clara's hand. "He's all we have." Reluctantly, Clara allowed them inside. She held Orion close as they prayed, hoping against hope that the boy would recover. But by morning, Tomas's condition had worsened. When he passed away later that day, the village's grief quickly turned to anger. "They said he was a miracle," one woman hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. "But he couldn't even save a child." "It's a curse," Hugo declared, seizing the moment to stoke the villagers' fear. "I told you he'd bring nothing but misfortune." The mob that gathered that night was larger and angrier than before. They marched to Clara's house with torches and pitchforks, their shouts echoing through the village. Clara, Eliza, and Father Elias stood on the porch, blocking the door as the crowd approached. "Give us the child," Hugo demanded, his face twisted with rage. "We'll take him to the church, where he belongs. Let them deal with him." "No," Clara said firmly, holding Orion close. "You're not taking him anywhere." The mob surged forward, But before they could reach the house, a blinding light erupted from within. Orion's cry rang out once again, louder and more powerful than before. The villagers froze, their weapons falling from their hands as the light engulfed them. When the light faded, the villagers found themselves back in the center of the village, disoriented and shaken. Hugo was on his knees, tears streaming down his face. "What have we done?" he whispered. Back at the house, Clara clutched Orion tightly, her heart pounding. She knew this was only the beginning. Whatever Orion was, his presence had set events in motion that couldn't be undone. And the world would never be the same. The days following the mob's dispersal were tense, the air in the village heavy with unspoken fears and questions. Though the villagers returned to their daily routines, an undercurrent of unease rippled through them. Some whispered that Orion's power had saved them from their own foolishness, while others were convinced the child was a danger too great to be left unchecked. Clara, meanwhile, grew increasingly protective, knowing it was only a matter of time before fear once again overtook reason. Eliza stayed by Clara's side, becoming her confidant and a second guardian to Orion. Together, they devised ways to shield him from the prying eyes of the villagers and the strangers from Arcanis, who hadn't left the village. The cloaked scholars now seemed to lurk at the edges of every gathering, their interest in Orion growing more intense with each passing day. Clara often caught them watching her home from the shadows, their faces obscured but their intentions unmistakable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara heard a soft knock at her door. She opened it cautiously to find Greta standing there, her expression unusually subdued. "Clara," Greta began, wringing her hands. "But I've come to warn you." Clara's brow furrowed. "Warn me about what?" Greta glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping inside. "The Arcanis men. They've been meeting with Hugo and some of the others. I overheard them talking in the tavern. They're planning to take Orion, with or without your consent." Clara's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed made her blood run cold. "When?" "Soon," Greta said, her voice trembling. "They're waiting for the right moment, but they've already paid Hugo and a few others to help." Eliza, who had been listening from the corner, stood abruptly. "We have to leave," she said, her voice firm. "Clara, we can't wait for them to come for him." Clara nodded slowly, her mind racing. "But where would we go?" "They'd follow us wherever we went." "There's the monastery in the hills," Greta suggested. "The monks there don't take sides in village disputes. They might shelter you." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was their only option. Clara turned to Greta. "Why are you helping us?" Greta hesitated, her eyes softening as they fell on Orion, who lay sleeping in his crib. "I've done a lot of talking in my time, Clara. Stirred up my share of trouble. But I can see now that this child, he's special. And I don't want to be the reason something terrible happens to him." Clara placed a hand on Greta's shoulder. "Thank you." That night, under the cover of darkness, Clara, Eliza, and Greta prepared to leave. Clara bundled Orion in a thick blanket, his tiny face peeking out as he slept. Luma, sensing the urgency, followed them willingly, her hooves barely making a sound on the dirt path. The journey to the monastery was treacherous, the narrow trail winding through dense forests and steep inclines. Clara's heart pounded with every rustle of leaves, certain that they were being followed. Their fears were confirmed when they heard voices behind them, distant but growing closer. "They've found us," Eliza whispered, her eyes wide. "We have to keep moving," Clara said, tightening her grip on Orion. But the pursuers were fast, and the group soon found themselves cornered at the edge of a cliff. The path ahead was blocked by a fallen tree, and the voices were now alarmingly close. Clara turned to Eliza and Greta, desperation in her eyes. "Take Orion and run. I'll hold them off." "No," Eliza said firmly. "We're not leaving you." Before Clara could argue, a blinding light erupted from Orion once again. The pursuers cried out, their torches extinguished as the light enveloped the forest. Clara shielded her eyes, her arms instinctively wrapping around Orion. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The pursuers were nowhere to be seen. "What just happened?" Greta asked, her voice trembling. Clara looked down at Orion, who was now awake, his wide eyes glowing faintly. "He protected us," she murmured, her voice filled with awe. Eliza stepped closer, her expression a mixture of fear and wonder. "Clara, he's not just a child. He's something more." "I know," Clara said softly. "But that doesn't change what we have to do. We need to get to the monastery." They reached the monastery at dawn, exhausted but relieved. The monks, dressed in simple robes and speaking in calm, measured tones, welcomed them without question. The abbot, a wise and gentle man named Brother Matthias, listened intently as Clara explained their situation. "You've brought a great burden here," Matthias said, his gaze resting on Orion. "But you've also brought a miracle. The boy's presence is profound. Will you help us?" Clara asked, her voice pleading. Matthias nodded. "You may stay here, and we will do what we can to protect him. But understand this. His power will draw attention, and not all of it will be benevolent. The Arcani scholars are not the only ones who seek such things." Clara's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Matthias's expression darkened. "There are forces in this world, both seen and unseen, that would seek to control a child like Orion. The power he possesses is rare, and with it comes great danger." The days that followed were peaceful but tense. The monks treated Orion with reverence, their quiet presence a welcome respite from the chaos of the village. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. One evening, as she sat by the fire with Eliza, Greta, and Brother Matthias, the abbot spoke. "You must prepare for what's to come. Orion's power will only grow as he does, and so will the threats against him." Clara looked at the child in her arms, her heart heavy with both love and fear. "What can we do?" "Raise him with love," Matthias said. "Teach him to use his power wisely. And when the time comes, you must let him choose his own path." Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew she would do whatever it took to protect Orion. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, Clara made a silent vow. No matter what lay ahead, she would stand by Orion's side, come what may. The weeks that followed were some of the most peaceful Clara had known in years, though the undercurrent of tension never truly faded. The monastery, tucked high in the hills and surrounded by dense woods, was a sanctuary untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The monks went about their quiet routines, offering Clara and her companions safety and sustenance without prying too deeply. Brother Matthias often sat with Clara, offering wisdom that gave her a fragile sense of hope. Orion, now just over a month old, was thriving. He had grown strong and alert, his bright eyes always watching the world with an intensity that felt far older than his few weeks of life. Luma, ever faithful, grazed in the monastery's fields, her bond with the child undiminished. The monks had taken to calling her the guardian, a fitting title for the cow that had carried the child into the world. But the calm was not to last. One morning, while Clara was collecting herbs in the monastery's garden, Eliza came running, her face pale and breathless. "Clara," she gasped, clutching Clara's arm. "They found us." Clara's blood ran cold. "Who?" "The Arcani scholars, and others. There's a large group of them, armed. Matthias says they're coming up the hill now." Clara's mind raced. She had known the Arcani's men wouldn't give up, but she hadn't expected them to act so soon, or with such force. "Where's Orion?" "Eliza has him in the sanctuary," Eliza said. "Matthias is preparing the monks to defend the monastery, but Clara, they're not warriors. They won't be able to hold them off." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. "We can't let them take him." The hours that followed were a blur of preparation and dread. The monks, armed with nothing but farming tools and their unshakable faith, fortified the monastery as best they could. Clara stayed with Orion, her heart breaking at the thought of what might happen if they failed. By midday, the attackers arrived. Led by the Arcani scholars, the group included mercenaries hired from the neighboring villages. They were armed with swords and shields, their intentions clear. From the safety of the sanctuary, Clara watched as Matthias stepped forward to meet them, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You have no business here," Matthias said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Leave this place." The lead scholar, The gaunt man who had first approached Clara in the village sneered. "You're harboring something that doesn't belong to you. We've come to claim it." "Orion is a child, not an object," Matthias replied firmly. "And he is under our protection." "Protection?" The scholar laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. That child's power is dangerous, uncontrolled. If you truly wish to protect him, you'll hand him over to us." Matthias shook his head. "We will not. You'll have to go through us." The scholar's face darkened. "So be it." The battle that followed was brief but brutal. The monks fought valiantly, their courage outweighing their inexperience, but they were no match for the trained mercenaries. As the attackers pushed closer to the sanctuary, Clara knew they were running out of time. Eliza, her face pale but determined, turned to Clara. "Take Orion and run. There's a path behind the monastery that leads to the river. If you follow it, you can escape." "I'm not leaving you," Clara said, her voice trembling. "You have to," Eliza insisted. "If they get him, everything we've done will be for nothing." Clara hesitated, her heart breaking at the thought of leaving Eliza and the monks behind. But she knew Eliza was right. With tears streaming down her face, she picked up Orion and ran. The path behind the monastery was narrow and treacherous, but Clara pressed on, the sound of battle fading behind her. Luma followed closely, her presence a comfort in the midst of Clara's fear. When they reached the river, Clara paused to catch her breath, her arms wrapped tightly around Orion. For a moment, it seemed they were safe. But then, a shadow fell across the water. Clara turned to see the gaunt scholar standing at the edge of the clearing, his cold eyes fixed on her. "You can't run forever," he said, stepping closer. "The child belongs to us." "No," Clara said, her voice shaking but defiant. "He belongs to no one." The scholar sneered. "You're a fool if you think you can protect him." Before he could step closer, Orion began to cry. The sound was soft at first, but it quickly grew louder, filling the air with its strange, melodic resonance. The scholar froze, his face twisting in fear as a golden light enveloped the clearing. The light grew brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. Clara shielded her eyes, clutching Orion tightly as the air around them seemed to shimmer. When the light faded, the scholar was gone, and the clearing was silent. Clara fell to her knees, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. She looked down at Orion, who was now quiet and calm, his wide eyes watching her with an almost knowing expression. From that day forward, Clara knew that Orion's power was far greater than she had ever imagined. But she also knew that with that power came great responsibility and danger. As she cradled the child in her arms, she made a silent vow to protect him, no matter the cost. In the years that followed, Clara and Orion lived in hiding, moving from place to place to avoid those who sought to control him. Eliza and Greta remained by their side, their bond unbreakable despite the trials they faced. And though their journey was fraught with danger and uncertainty, Clara never wavered in her love for Orion, or her belief that he was destined for something far greater than any of them could imagine.